The stadium was alive. Not just alive, it was breathing, pulsing, a living organism made of steel, concrete, sweat, and 50,000 screaming lungs. Floodlights cut through the night sky like blades of fire, swinging wildly over the endless crowd that surged and rippled in the stands. Every cheer, every clap, every stomp reverberated to the bones of the arena, shaking it until even the earth beneath felt like it was humming. And at the very center of that storm stood Freddie Mercury. He was a silhouette at first, the lights behind him so bright that the audience saw him not as a man, but as something larger, something carved out of pure energy. Then he stepped forward, strutting with that unmistakable gait, chest glistening with sweat, his iconic white tank clinging to his frame. The spotlight locked on, and suddenly there he was in all his glory. The mustache, the fire in his eyes, the way his hand gripped the microphone stand like it was a sword. The crowd erupted again, louder than before. They weren't just cheering him. They were surrendering to him. "Are you ready?" Freddie bellowed, his voice amplified into something almost godlike. The sound cannonied through the arena, and the crowd answered back with a roar so deafening it swallowed the very question whole. Brian May struck a chord. Roger Taylor's drumsticks came down like thunder. The opening notes of Radio GAGA exploded into the night, and the entire stadium became a wave of synchronized hands clapping to the rhythm, thousands of palms smacking in unison, like a giant heartbeat Freddie himself was conducting. It was electric. It was dangerous. It was perfect. Freddie prowled the stage with feline precision, thrusting his microphone toward the audience, daring them to sing louder. They obeyed. He leaned back, mouth wide, unleashing a note that seemed to scrape the stars themselves. The band was tight, ferocious, playing as though their instruments might burst into flames if they struck them any harder. But for Freddie, this wasn't just another night. It was his battlefield, his cathedral, his playground. He knew how to ride the chaos, bend it, tame it until it belonged entirely to him. And tonight, more than ever, he had them. He had them all. The second verse hit, and Freddie was in full command, strutting to the edge of the stage, sweat dripping down his arms as he leaned into the crowd. "All we hear is," he cried, thrusting the mic outward. "Radio GAGA," 50,000 voices screamed back. "Radio Goo Goo." "Radio GAGA." The call and response echoed like rolling thunder. Freddie grinned, that mischievous, playful grin that made him both untouchable and utterly human at once. He was feeding off them, and they were feeding off him. It was an endless cycle of energy no one wanted to break. And then it happened. It cut through like a razor through silk. A sound so small, so fragile, it should have been swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the noise. But somehow impossibly it wasn't. A voice. From somewhere in the middle rows, beneath the tidal wave of claps and chants and screams, a single voice rang out. It wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't even loud. It was different, clear, emotional, almost pleading. Freddie stopped dead. It was like the world skipped a beat. His body froze mid-step, one hand still clutching the microphone stand, the other raised in the air as if commanding the sky. His mouth hung open, but no sound came. Brian May glanced over, eyebrows furrowing as his fingers hesitated on the strings. Roger's drumbeat stumbled for a fraction of a second before recovering, but it was too late. The band felt it too. Something had shifted. The crowd noticed instantly. The clapping faltered, the synchronized rhythm unraveling into confusion. 50,000 people looked around, puzzled, straining to understand why their godlike frontman had suddenly gone silent. Freddie's eyes darted into the sea of faces, scanning, searching. His chest rose and fell faster now, not from the singing, not from the adrenaline, but from something else, something rawer. For a moment, the noise of the stadium began to collapse inward. The roars dwindled into murmurs. The clapping slowed, until the arena, this monstrous sound and chaos, grew uneasy. People whispered to one another, craning their necks toward the section Freddie was staring at. And then, impossibly, the voice called out again. It wasn't angry. It wasn't drunk. It wasn't meant to challenge or embarrass. It was delicate, trembling, but carrying a weight that made it echo louder than the amplifiers. Freddie blinked. His knuckles whitened on the microphone stand. His lips parted, but he said nothing. The crowd's confusion turned into silence. The stadium, the very same stadium that had been howling with chaos seconds before, became something else entirely. Still, waiting. Freddie lowered the microphone, as if afraid to break the moment. His head tilted slightly, his gaze narrowing into the endless sea of faces. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't strutting. He wasn't performing. He was listening. And for the first time all night, 50,000 people realized they weren't watching a show. They were watching something real unfold in front of them. The voice had pierced the armor of sound, the armor of performance, and it had reached him. Reached Freddie Mercury, the man who seemed untouchable, larger than life, above it all. But in that instant, he wasn't above it. He was human, and everyone in the stadium felt the shift in their bones. Cliffhanger. Freddie leaned forward slowly, gripping the mic tighter, his eyes still locked on the spot in the crowd. His voice came low, hesitant, breaking the silence. Did anyone else hear that? If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. For a long moment, nothing moved. The stadium that had been roaring like a storm just seconds ago now held its collective breath. Thousands of bodies leaning forward, as if pulled by an invisible string. 50,000 faces turned toward the same place, eyes darting, ears straining, waiting for the sound to return. And then it did. The voice came again, clearer this time, though it still trembled. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't brash. It was raw, soaked in emotion, almost breaking under its own weight. "Freddie," it cried. Not screamed, not demanded, cried. The kind of cry that cut straight through the ribcage and hit something deep in the chest. It was a plea, not for attention, but for connection. Freddie's grip tightened around the microphone stand, his eyes fixed on the direction of the voice, unblinking. For once, the man who could command entire stadiums with a single flick of his wrist seemed uncertain. "Freddie." The voice called again, softer this time, but filled with the kind of desperation that silences armies. The murmurs rippled through the stands. People pointed, trying to locate where it was coming from. Others hissed for quiet, afraid they might miss the next word. Security guards in yellow jackets began shifting nervously toward the section, prepared to remove what they assumed was just another overzealous fan. But Freddie raised his hand. A sharp, sudden gesture, and the men froze. "Leave them," he said into the mic, his voice low but carrying. The sound echoed across the hushed stadium. "Don't touch them." The crowd gasped. Every camera, every eye, every heartbeat was on him. Freddie stepped forward, one polished boot clicking against the stage floor. His gaze sharpened, his mustache twitching as his jaw tightened. He tilted his head, almost feline, hunting for the source of the voice. "What is it?" he asked, his tone softer now, stripped of theatrics. This wasn't the showman speaking. This was Freddie the man. A hush rippled so thick across the arena that you could hear the faint crackle of the amplifiers. Then out of the darkness, the voice answered, "I love you." It broke on the last word, cracking with emotion, but it rang out like a shot all the same. Freddie's lips parted, his brow furrowed, and for a heartbeat it looked as if he might crumble right there on stage. He gripped the stand tighter, steadying himself. Around him, the crowd's reaction fractured. Some people cheered instinctively, wanting to fill the silence with noise. Others booed the interruption, jealous or protective. But the majority stayed still, too captivated by the way Freddie's expression shifted. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't annoyance. It was something else. The band exchanged glances behind him. Brian May's fingers hovered nervously over his guitar strings, ready to pick up if Freddie wanted to brush past it and dive back into the music. Roger twirled a drumstick, bouncing it against his knee, eyes darting like he was waiting for orders. Even John Deacon, usually calm as stone, shifted on his feet. But Freddie didn't move on. Instead, he leaned closer to the microphone. His voice, usually a roaring weapon, was barely above a whisper. "Say it again." A collective gasp rolled across the audience. They couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Freddie Mercury, the man who never lost control, the man who always turned interruptions into jokes or dismissals, was asking for it to be repeated. The voice answered, shaking but determined. "I love you, Freddie." This time, it didn't crack. It soared, echoing across the hushed arena with a strange purity. Freddie closed his eyes. For the first time all night, he looked vulnerable, stripped bare beneath the lights. His chest rose and fell quickly, as though he just sprinted, but he hadn't moved at all. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened. "You hear that?" he asked the crowd, his voice trembling with an emotion none of them had heard before. "You all heard that?" A murmur of agreement swept through the stadium. Some cheered, some shouted back, "We love you too." But it didn't matter. Freddie wasn't talking to them. Not yet. He took a step back, pressing a hand against his chest. For a moment, it looked like he might turn away, hide, bury the moment beneath the next verse. But he didn't. He stepped forward again, closer to the edge of the stage than he'd been all night. His eyes were locked, his soul tethered to that one voice. "Darling," he said softly, "say it again just for me." The crowd was shaking now, torn between awe and disbelief. They wanted to scream, to cheer, to sing, but none of them dared. They didn't want to ruin it. They didn't want to break the spell. And then, for the third time, the voice rose from the sea of people. Stronger now, steadier, filled with a kind of unshakable truth. "I love you, Freddie Mercury." The stadium erupted, not with laughter, not with mockery, with applause, with cheers that shook the sky. Tens of thousands of people threw their arms in the air, clapping, shouting, crying, as though they themselves had spoken those words. Freddie staggered backward a step, overwhelmed. His hand brushed across his mouth, trembling slightly. For once, the man who built his reputation on control, on bending the will of audiences, was utterly undone. He didn't grin. He didn't wink. He didn't strut. Instead, he pressed his free hand against his heart, bowing his head toward the section of the crowd where the voice had come from. "Darling," he said again, softer now, almost himself. "You've melted me." The audience roared, but this time it wasn't just noise. It was love, pure, unfiltered love bouncing back from 50,000 throats, filling the night sky with something bigger than music. Brian May finally strummed a gentle chord, trying to anchor the moment before it carried Freddie away completely. Roger tapped a soft beat on the snare. John added a steady hum beneath it. And suddenly the band wasn't just playing. They were cushioning Freddie, holding him steady with their sound. Freddie lifted his head, tears glittering in his eyes. He grinned then, wide and radiant, but not the grin of the performer. The grin of a man who had just been reminded why he did this in the first place. He leaned into the microphone one more time. "This is why I sing," he said, voice breaking just enough to make 50,000 hearts break with him. "Because of you." The audience exploded again, cheers, screams, chants. But under all of it, Freddie heard it. That single voice, still calling out, still clear, still his. And for the rest of the night, everything he sang carried that weight, that tenderness, that raw truth. He hadn't just been heard. He had listened. And everyone there knew they had witnessed something no stadium on earth could ever replicate again. Cliffhanger into Act 3. Freddie raises his hand suddenly, silencing the band mid-song. His eyes blaze as he leans into the mic and says, "Sing it with me." The sound of the crowd thundered through the night, but Freddie Mercury lifted his hand, and the music stopped on a dime. Brian's guitar fell silent. Roger froze mid-swing with his sticks, and even John's steady bass line evaporated into the air. The arena collapsed into an uncanny hush, broken only by the distant hum of amplifiers and the faint sound of 50,000 hearts hammering in unison. "Sing it with me," Freddie said, his voice low, steady, commanding. The words weren't directed at the whole stadium. Though everyone heard them, they were for that one voice, the one that had pierced through the noise like lightning through a storm. The audience stirred uneasily. They weren't sure if this was still part of the show, or if something entirely unscripted was unfolding. Queen wasn't a band that stopped mid-song. Freddie Mercury wasn't a man who yielded control to anyone. And yet, here he was, standing on the edge of the stage, body tense, eyes locked on a single point in the ocean of faces. "Come on, darling," Freddie urged softly into Mike. "Don't be shy now." You've already stolen the show. For a moment, nothing. Just silence. The weight of expectation was unbearable, pressing down on everyone in the arena. You could almost hear the collective thought racing through 50,000 minds. Will they answer? Then it came. A voice, fragile yet strong enough to travel the length of the stadium. A single line from a Queen song, shaky, imperfect, but real. I want to break free. It wavered, cracked on the last word, and then fell away into silence. The audience gasped. Some clapped. Others cheered. But most waited, holding themselves back, knowing instinctively this was no ordinary sing-along. Freddie's mouth curved into a slow smile. Not his stage grin, not his cheeky smirk. Something gentler, something private. You see, he said into the microphone, his voice ringing clear and tender. Even the smallest voice can fill the biggest stadium. The crowd erupted at that, a wave of applause and cheers crashing over the arena. But Freddie raised his hand again, demanding silence, and remarkably, they obeyed. Tens of thousands of people swallowed their excitement, desperate not to miss what would happen next. Freddie leaned forward, eyes narrowed, pointing the microphone like an arrow toward the section where the voice had come from. Again, he said. Sing it again. Louder this time. Don't be afraid. The arena held its breath. The voice rose again, stronger now, steadier, less trembling under the weight of 50,000 stares. I want to break free. Freddie's smile widened. He stepped back, letting the note echo across the hushed expanse, his own chest rising and falling with something close to awe. Then, in a flash of pure instinct, he lifted the mic to his lips and joined in. I want to break free. The sound of Freddie Mercury's voice, rich and soaring, collided with a smaller, trembling voice in the stands, creating a harmony so unexpected it sent chills down spines. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was alive. The crowd exploded again, unable to hold back. Cheers, claps, shouts, a tidal wave of noise. And this time, Freddie didn't silence them. He fed them. He leaned back, thrusting the microphone toward the audience, daring them to join. And they did. 50,000 voices rose together, echoing the words. I want to break free. The stadium shook with it. It was no longer a concert. It was communion, a single, massive voice born of countless smaller ones, all because one person had dared to cry out. Freddie's eyes glistened under the spotlights. He clutched the mic stand like a lifeline, his knuckles white, his grin unrestrained. He tilted his head back, let the sound wash over him, then slammed his boot against the stage, commanding the band to join in. Brian ripped into chords. Roger's drums thundered back to life. John's bass rumbled like an earthquake. And just like that, Queen was playing again, but not the way they had before. This wasn't a rehearsed set list. This was raw, reckless, born in the moment. Freddie leaned into the song with everything he had. His voice soared, crashing against the walls of the stadium, but he never once stopped looking at the spot where that single voice had come from. You hear that? He cried between lines. They're with you now. The crowd roared back, screaming the lyrics at the top of their lungs. People were crying, strangers clinging to each other, swept up in the sheer electricity of the moment. And Freddie was transformed. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was channeling something greater, something that couldn't be rehearsed, scripted, or staged. His body arched, his fists clenched, his face glowing with sweat and tears and unfiltered joy. The song built into a frenzy, the audience louder than the amplifiers, until the very concrete beneath their feet trembled. And when it hit its peak, Freddie cut the music again with a sudden, sharp gesture. The band halted. The crowd hushed. Freddie stood at the center of the stage, chest heaving, eyes burning. He pointed again, directly into the sea of faces. Your turn, he said. For a moment, there was confusion. Then, slowly, timidly, the voice sang once more, carrying across the silence like a prayer. I want to break free. And Freddie Mercury, the man who had just commanded 50,000 people into silence, dropped to his knees on the stage and bowed his head toward the sound. The crowd went insane. Cameras flashed. People screamed. But above it all, what lingered was not chaos. It was awe. Freddie rose slowly, gripping the mic, his face damp with sweat and something more. He looked out at the crowd, then back toward the voice, and whispered into the microphone, "You've broken me, darling, and I thank you." The audience erupted again, this time in a standing ovation that shook the entire stadium. Brian strummed softly behind him. Roger tapped a heartbeat rhythm. John kept the bass low, and together, they cradled Freddie's words like music itself was bowing to the moment. Freddie took a step back, staring into the void of faces, and for once, the mask of performer was gone. What remained was a man, raw and undone, standing before 50,000 people with nothing but gratitude and vulnerability. And everyone in the arena, every single person, felt it. Cliffhanger into Act 4. Freddie grips the mic with both hands, swaying slightly, then whispers into the silence. "Let's sing together, all of us." "Let's sing together," Freddie whispered, gripping the microphone stand like it was the only thing tethering him to earth. His voice was low, intimate, yet it rippled through the vast stadium as if whispered into every ear at once. "All of us." For a split second, the stadium seemed to hesitate. 50,000 people stood caught between disbelief and anticipation, unsure if Freddie really meant it. Then Brian May struck a soft, shimmering chord, and Roger tapped out a heartbeat rhythm on the snare. The sound was fragile at first, tentative, like a candle flame flickering in the wind. Freddie leaned forward, eyes closed, and sang the line again, "I want to break free." And this time, 50,000 voices answered. It wasn't perfect. Some voices were out of key. Others cracked from screaming too much already. But together, the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't a choir. It was humanity itself, pouring out its lungs in unison. The words soared into the night sky, lifting higher and higher until it felt like even the stars were listening. Freddie staggered back a step, pressing his hand against his chest as though steadying himself against the sheer force of it. His eyes flew open, glittering with tears, and he thrust the microphone toward the crowd, urging them louder. "Yes, sing it, darlings." Louder. The stadium obeyed. "I want to break free." The roar of voices shook the steel rafters, a wave of sound so massive it felt like the arena itself might split apart. People in the nosebleeds clutched each other, crying, while those on the floor threw their arms around strangers, swaying together. For once, there were no sections, no divisions. Just one sound, one voice, one heartbeat. And at the center of it all stood Freddie Mercury, undone, his mascara smudged, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat, but his face was lit with something unearthly. He looked out at the sea of people, each one singing not just to him, but to each other, to themselves, to something greater than all of them. He turned back to the band, motioning urgently. Brian's fingers danced across the guitar, weaving a melody like silk threads to the wall of voices. Roger added cymbal swells that shimmered like ocean waves. John's bass anchored it, grounding the storm. Freddie stepped forward again, lifting his microphone to his lips. His voice crashed into the song, soaring above the audience like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. "I've fallen in love." The crowd echoed it, broken but beautiful. "I've fallen in love for the first time." The sound swelled, a tidal wave of voices colliding with Freddie's, lifting him higher, carrying him further. His knees buckled, but he caught himself on the mic stand, grinning through the tears streaking his face. "Darling, you've melted me," he cried suddenly, and the crowd roared, stamping their feet, clapping their hands, filling the stadium with thunder. Then, in an act of pure instinct, Freddie did something no one expected. He set down the microphone. He placed it carefully on the stage floor, stepped back, and raised his arms wide. He wasn't going to sing anymore. He didn't need to. The audience gasped, unsure, then realized what he wanted. The voices rose again, louder than ever. 50,000 throats tearing into the chorus, filling the air until it seemed to vibrate with love itself. "I want to break free." Freddie tilted his head back, eyes closed, arms still outstretched. The sound washed over him like a wave, crashing against his body, pouring through him until he was no longer a performer and they were no longer the audience. They were one. The cameras flashed. Lighters and torches ignited across the stands, turning the stadium into a galaxy of flickering stars. Strangers held hands. Lovers kissed through tears. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders so they could see. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a confession, a prayer, a collective cry from tens of thousands of souls. Freddie opened his eyes again, glittering in the floodlights. He looked out into the dark sea of faces, searching for the source of that first voice. And when he found it, his expression softened into something almost private. He pointed. The crowd followed his gesture, thousands of heads turning. A spotlight swept the stands until it landed on a single figure. The voice. A young fan, face wet with tears, clutching their chest as though the sound itself had cracked them open. The stadium roared in recognition, but Freddie shook his head, raising both hands for silence. "Shoo!" he whispered into the mic he'd picked back up. "Don't drown them out. This is their moment." The roar fell to silence again, 50,000 people obeying as if under a spell. The spotlight clung to the fan, trembling under the weight of all those eyes. Freddie smiled, tender and true. "Sing it again, darling. Just you." The fan hesitated, then opened their mouth. "I want to break free." The voice cracked, wavering, but it didn't matter. The sound carried, fragile and pure, across the entire stadium. And when it ended, the silence that followed was deafening. Then Freddie clapped. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the mic. The band joined in. The audience followed. 50,000 pairs of hands smacking in rhythm until the arena pulsed like a giant drum. Freddie leaned into the mic, grinning through his tears. "You see? That's courage. That's love. That's why we're here." The crowd erupted again, not in chaos, but in a roar of adoration. People weren't just cheering for Freddie anymore. They were cheering for the fan, for themselves, for every voice that had ever felt small, but still dared to be heard. Brian ripped into the chorus one last time. Roger pounded the drums. John's bass rumbled, and Freddie sang with them. But this time, he wasn't leading. He was one of them. The final chorus shook the sky. "I want to break free." The song ended in an explosion of sound and light, fireworks bursting above the stadium, confetti raining down like stardust. Freddie stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, face glowing, utterly undone. He raised the mic one last time, his voice breaking with sincerity. "Darling, you've melted me. You've melted all of us." The stadium shook with a response, a roar so massive it seemed to lift the roof off the building. People cried. People laughed. People screamed until their throats gave out. And they knew, all of them, that they had witnessed something they would never, ever forget. The final notes of "I Want to Break Free" dissolved into the night, swallowed by the roar of 50,000 voices that refused to stop. The stadium was shaking. People were stamping their feet, clapping their hands, hugging strangers as if they had known them all their lives. It wasn't in a song anymore. It was the end of something bigger, something no one had words for. Freddie stood in the middle of the stage, sweat dripping down his face, chest heaving, his white tank clinging to him like a second skin. But he didn't care about how he looked. He wasn't thinking about the cameras or the critics or the history books. He was just standing there, hand pressed against his chest, staring out into a sea of faces that glowed with lighters, tears, and sheer disbelief. For once, the man who had mastered the art of controlling an audience seemed lost for words. He leaned into the mic, voice breaking, raw and human. "I'll never forget tonight," he whispered. The crowd erupted again, a wave of sound so powerful it felt like the arena might lift off the ground. Freddie smiled wide and radiant. But behind it there was something more, a softness, a vulnerability that rarely peeked through the armor of his showmanship. He glanced back at Brian, Roger, and John. They weren't just bandmates tonight. They were witnesses. Brian's curls were damp, his face slack with awe. Roger twirled a drumstick in his fingers, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he had just seen. John's usually unreadable face glowed with something close to pride. Freddie raised his arm, pointing again toward the section where the voice had come from. "That," he said, his voice cracking into the mic, "that's what music is for. That's what this is all about. One voice, one person. And tonight, they reminded me why I do this, why we do this." The stadium roared again. People stomped and screamed until their lungs gave out. And in that moment, every fan in the arena felt it. The sense that they weren't just part of an audience. They were part of family, a living organism bound together by sound and love. The show went on, but it wasn't the same. Every song after that carried the afterglow of what had happened. When Freddie sang Somebody to Love, the crowd sang it louder than ever before, their voices desperate and triumphant all at once. When Queen toured into Bohemian Rhapsody, the arena didn't just echo the operatic section. It drowned the band out completely. Freddie laughed into the microphone, letting the crowd take over, knowing they had already been transformed. Even We Are the Champions, a song the world had sung 1,000 times, felt new. This wasn't about victory over others. It was about survival, connection, courage. When Freddie stretched his arms wide and let the final note soar, it wasn't just a performance. It was a benediction. And all the while, the memory of that single voice lingered. Backstage, after the encore, the crew buzzed like bees. People were shouting over each other, trying to process what they'd just seen. Technicians wiped their eyes, pretending it was sweat. Cameramen who had filmed dozens of concerts stood frozen, clutching their equipment like relics. Even hardened security guards, the kind who had seen every kind of crowd chaos imaginable, shook their heads in disbelief. That was history, one whispered. I don't know what else to call it. That was history. Brian May walked over to Freddie, his guitar still slung across his shoulder. You know that wasn't just a show, right? He said, voice low, almost reverent. Freddie smirked, though his lips trembled. Darling, it's never just a show. Roger leaned against his drum kit, staring out at the still roaring crowd. They'll never forget tonight, he said quietly. None of them. And he was right. Word spread like wildfire. By the next morning, newspapers were already writing about it. Headlines screamed, Freddie stops concert for one voice, and Mercury melts stadium with moment of pure humanity. Bootleg recordings began circulating within days, capturing the exact moment Freddie stopped mid-song and gave the stage, the stadium, the world to one voice in the crowd. Fans who had been there swore it was the most unforgettable night of their lives. People who weren't there wished desperately that they had been. And slowly, the story grew into legend. They called it the Night of the Voice. It wasn't about technical perfection. It wasn't about Queen's set list or Freddie's vocals, though both were extraordinary. It was about the moment when a superstar, standing at the peak of his power, chose to stop everything and listen. It was about a man who could command 50,000 people with a flick of his hand, yet knelt on stage to honor the smallest, most fragile voice in the room. It was about courage, connection, love. For the fan who had cried out, life was never the same. Interviews years later revealed that they hadn't planned it, hadn't thought about being heard. They had just felt overwhelmed, overcome, and blurted out the only words that mattered. I love you, Freddie. And somehow, impossibly, he had heard. But the story didn't just belong to that fan. It belonged to everyone in the arena. Because in that moment, everyone felt seen. Everyone felt heard. Everyone felt like their voice mattered. Even Freddie himself carried it with him. In later interviews, when asked about his greatest performances, he never gave a straight answer. But once, when pressed, he smiled and said, there was one night when the crowd melted me. Just one voice, but it was enough. That's the one I'll remember. And the truth was, so would they. Because long after the lights dimmed, long after the last echoes faded into the night, people still spoke of it. Parents told their children. Friends passed the story along. Strangers bonded over it. And decades later, fans who hadn't even been born would watch the grainy recordings and feel chills, as if they too had been there. Because what happened that night wasn't just music. It was humanity at its most raw, its most beautiful. Freddie Mercury had heard a voice in the crowd, and his reaction melted everyone. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.